All right. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our January edition of the PMI Western Idaho Chapter Lunch and Learn. Excited to have you here. A couple of housekeeping items, as usual. After the meeting, we'll be sharing the content that Jeff's going to share today, along with reporting instructions for your PDUs or your PDU for this session. So keep an eye out for your email and watch that. As far as this session today, just note on your right-hand side of the screen in the right-hand menu in Hopin, you'll see a session Q&A section. That's where we will have the Q&A. Any questions you might have for Jeff, please post them there. We'll be having some polls as well during the session, so be watching for when it's time to respond to polls. And then finally, another plug for speakers for the Lunch and Learn. Should you know someone, or maybe you've had an experience with a great speaker recently that you think would be interesting for chapter members, just reach out to me. I'm Brian Russell. Learn at pmiwic.org is where you can reach me at. Appreciate that. So with that, let me provide a quick intro for Jeff. So Jeff is the founder of iTrain IT Leaders, LLC. He's also the co-founder and president of the Boise ITSM Local Interest Group, and enjoys mentoring, coaching, and collaborating with his peers in the PMI Western Idaho chapter, the Treasure Valley Agile community, and in Toastmasters International. He's delivered multiple training classes and presentations in ITIL, Agile, value stream mapping, and DevOps practices to audiences across the U.S., the USA, and globally. Recently, Jeff was recognized for his work authoring content and providing feedback for the ITIL 4 Digital and IT Strategy publication, and was highlighted as a feature speaker at the 2020 and 2021 Service Management World Conferences. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jeff. Welcome. And we're excited to hear what you have to inform us of today.
All right. Thank you very much, Brian, for the introduction. And yeah, happy to be here with all of you today. Appreciate you joining in. And we're here to learn and discuss portfolio management, and especially in the context of, in my intro, Brian mentioned the Digital and IT Strategy publication. A lot of the discussion that we're going to have today is about how do we look at portfolios and how can they help enable our organizations in the context of digital transformations and working on our digital and IT strategies. I have a couple of poll questions just to understand a little bit more about all of you to get us started in terms of your context of your work within portfolio management. So George, if you could please fire up the first poll question, we'll go ahead and have those go through. All right, see the first one coming up. So first question is all about understanding your level of familiarity with your organization's portfolio.
Yeah, so look, if you're having trouble finding the polls, look under the session tab on your right menu, and then you'll see polls, and then the first question to respond to. I think we've gotten a dozen or so responses so far. All right, it looks like a vast, well, not a vast majority, but a big majority of yes and somewhat.
Right,
does my organization have a portfolio?
Yeah. Surprisingly, some don't necessarily do, or at least if they have one, it's not necessarily as well organized as it could be. All right, very good. And let's go ahead and do the second question as well. This question is just understanding if this has been something that's been part of your job responsibilities, if you've worked in or if you currently work in the portfolio management area.
right. A little bit more scattered responses there, but not directly. This is the most popular one.
Okay.
Can you see the poll results, I'm assuming, Jeff?
I can't actually.
Okay.
Hang on.
Okay. Yeah, you have to vote and then you can see the results.
Okay, it didn't give me the choice. Oh, maybe I need to hit submit response. That'd be why.
Yep.
There we go. Just have to vote. Okay, now I can see them. All right, good. All right, appreciate the feedback from everyone. And part of what we tried to do in this presentation is to tailor it to both audiences, for people that have directly or are currently working directly in the portfolio management space, as well as for those that maybe are working more at the project level and maybe at a team level and haven't as much. So good to see this and good to know. And it is pretty scattered as far as people's roles. And for the 3 people that are doing that in your current position responsibility, or have in the past with the 5, it makes up a good part of the audience. And so that's definitely good to see. So appreciate that. And we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Thanks for that, team. Appreciate you running those and putting those together for me, George. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Let me see if I can get this into presentation mode here, because I do have a little bit of transition and animation going on. All right, is everyone seeing my screen? If I could get a verbal.
Yep.
All right, appreciate it.
Yep, you can see it.
Okay, so first off, I want to talk a little bit about this presentation. And again, in my introduction, I mentioned the fact that I've had an opportunity to speak at some larger international conferences over the last couple of years. And this last couple of months ago in November, I got to attend the Service Management World Conference in Orlando in November. And I co-presented this presentation with David Cannon, who's one of the industry top 25 thought leaders in the IT service management space. He works at a company called, and it's actually executive vice president of a company called Infinity 3. So I want to make sure I gave him co-authorship credit on this deck. He and I had the opportunity to work on this together for several months ahead of presenting at that conference. And quickly after we finished giving that presentation, we both felt like it would be a fantastic presentation to deliver to the project management community as well. And a lot of you, either directly or indirectly, as evidenced by your poll answers, are involved in portfolio management and want to provide a little bit of a different approach or a little different take than what you might see from a traditional PMBOK perspective with regard to portfolio management, and a little bit more of a service management view, and put together a little bit of a picture of why optimizing your service portfolio is so important in the context of supporting your organization's digital strategy. Start off this presentation with an agenda slide, and really I'm going to start with the very beginning, with the conclusion at the beginning, which is the what's in it for me, and why we feel like, as we put this together, putting together an understanding of service portfolios and how that fits into your digital and IT strategy is so important. I know some of you are probably not working in an IT PM space or in an IT organization, and that's okay. Some of what we talk about is certainly in that context of information technology. As I'm sure all of you know, information technology is a component of, but not necessarily the same thing as, a digital strategy or being part of a digital organization. So I'll talk about some of those nuances as we go through here. And then we'll talk about the challenge for digital organizations and why portfolio management really is the answer to the question in a lot of these situations to help us effectively manage digital transformations or to respond to digital disruption. Talk a little bit about where to start if you don't have an effective portfolio today, or if you're just starting to build one from scratch. I mean, a lot of the consulting work that I've done is helping organizations start up and define their PMO, and especially at an enterprise level sometimes versus just at an IT level. And then how do we successfully use those in a digital organization? So the what's in it for me slide, the WIFM slide. In many organizations, and this is a generic statement, I know many of you who are working at a portfolio level and answered the question in the affirmative are working and are responsible for your organization strategy, either directly or as part of a feedback loop. But for many of us, we aren't. But we have to recognize as we move into becoming more of digital organizations and we look at our organizations need to respond to different opportunities or different threats in our environments and our ecosystem, everything that we do in a digital world ultimately has a strategic impact. And we'll take a look at some of those characteristics as we go forward. So as part of what we want to do in this presentation that we presented at Service Management World and I'm bringing to all of you now is we want to make sure that we can show how effectively managing your portfolio is critical to making your strategic initiative successful. We want to show you how you can participate in some of the business decision making about digital technology and really think about the big picture from an IT leadership as well as an overall organizational leadership perspective. And that if we have an effective portfolio approach, we can make sure that we have the greatest positive impact in those spaces as possible. We can align existing and emerging investments in a more effective way. And especially when we are dealing with disruption, where we most likely have shortened strategic cycles and decision-making that needs to happen, we can make those decisions in a better and a faster and a more effective way. I'm going to share a common scenario real quickly and won't spend too much time on this, but this comes directly from one of my previous clients. And I was working in a consulting role and helping to stand up a portfolio in a project management office with a bank. And they were working as their main critical project, trying to improve their customer onboarding for their commercial customers and utilizing digital technology to do so in order to produce the required documents based upon the specific in-scope product offerings for that commercial client. And a lot of that was required for regulatory and compliance perspectives, for disclosures and signatures and things like that. And current state for them is that they're producing all those required documents manually in different parts of the organization. We're producing those, and then it required an operational QA review, and a lot of that work was manual, and it resulted in a lot of issues for the bank. They were having poor data quality. Sometimes that was due to manual entry. It led to different documents being completed in different time frames and the rework that went around that. And because there were different aspects of how this was put together, it led to a disjointed customer experience, different touch points and interactions with different parts of the bank and not a single point of entry. And the bank was really falling behind some of their competitors, where the expectation with working with other banks or just working with other service providers was that all this should just be one and done. It should be all electronic. It should be very fast and high quality and very efficient. And as I mentioned, this new onboarding tool that was being developed from a digital technology perspective was helping to resolve those issues and was the highest priority project at the bank. And this had an impact to both customer market relevance and operational excellence from a strategy standpoint. If the bank doesn't get this figured out and get up to speed, they're going to continue to potentially bleed customers. And there was evidence of that. There was a lot of satisfaction and experience feedback coming in that was negative. But it also led to operational excellence issues. If you think about just the need for those different touch points internally and separate QA steps and manual work, the rework and the unplanned work that went around that needed to improve things from an OpEx perspective as well. And you see this, and this is just an example from one client. This is going on in a lot of organizations. And if you think about the need for digital transformation, a lot of times it's because we haven't been doing the necessary work to be relevant in terms of our use of digital technology and having a cohesive digital strategy to make sure that we aren't falling behind. And now we have to transform to catch up in those spaces. So the challenge for digital organizations from an IT service management perspective, if we think about how our strategies typically work and how moving into more of a digital organization in a digital transformation space changes that, typically over history, and especially previous to the last 10, 15 years or so, we work through a very traditional waterfall type of a model where we go through our plan, build, and run perspectives, and we do whatever frequency of quarterly or semi-annual releases, and we've worked through those for a long time. And as we've seen the introduction of more and more rate of change through digital technology over time, we've started to move into seeing this type of an influence happening where in a lot of organizations, and this can be both top-down scanning the environment and doing benchmarking, as well as from a bottom-up perspective where people are finding new ways of doing things with their touchpads or with their phones, you're seeing a lot of innovation going on. And that obviously over time is going to influence how we operate as an organization. And typically when we first start out in that innovation phase, there's very few people in our organization that are good at doing those specialized things and working to develop those specialized organizational capabilities. But over time, those things become more common, more people start to use them, and they move into more of that commoditized space where they become not so much a competitive advantage or part of a unique value proposition, but there's lots of organizations that are doing these things now. And ultimately, then that can move to an outsourced type of a strategy where you look at how we've transitioned to the cloud as an example, and there's lots of providers, and we'll talk about cloud a little bit more in this context coming up, but we go through that cycle. And as a result of that, the rate of change is increasing faster and faster. The impacts of that feedback loop into our strategic decision-making are going to be there. And so we're going to then move into more of a cycle that looks like what we show here on the right, where you're moving at a much more agile rate, a much faster rate, working through those traditional build and run cycles and making sure not only are we effectively planning that work, but then we're going to be iterating through lots of potentially smaller, quicker releases, more iterations, more of that minimum viable type of an approach. And then of course, we need to make sure that our support model for all of those things, whether that's in-house or whether that's through sources, things become commoditized as part of the equation. We have that cycle working through as we move into more of our digital world. And I'm sure most of you have seen that type of a change in your model, at least in parts of your organization over time. So as we start there, then we're going to take a look at that from the perspective of how that digital transformation, that digital disruption is going to accelerate our strategic initiative. So our organization hopefully has a well-defined purpose and vision for why we exist and what we're trying to achieve and where we want to be from a perspective standpoint in the future. So we take a look at our traditional ways of doing things when things are typically non-chaotic or non-volatile. Most organizations work through typical annual cycles where we'll define our strategy as a part of a plan of record and we'll align our funding mechanisms for that year. And we'll have a handful of strategic initiatives, typically more than two, but a handful of things that we're working toward. As mentioned for the bank, working toward being able to do more of something like electronic signatures versus having to send paperwork back and forth manually and having multiple steps. That in and of itself could just be a strategic initiative that the bank might work through over the course of a year. But then if you think about it, over time, we started to see those strategic cycles just naturally start to get shorter as we try and bring in perspectives like agile portfolio management and not being locked into having to have funding locked in just once a year and some of those things. So those things over time are starting to shorten and get a little bit less decreased. But if we truly have something that happens at a disruptive level and can bring in COVID, obviously, is a very common and recent example. Sometimes our strategies and our decision-making around our initiatives is going to dramatically change. And so we're going to be in a situation now where our strategic cycles, we're figuring out how to get people enabled to work remotely or to have new ways of purchasing our products and services. We're going to potentially have strategies and strategic initiatives that last a couple of months, maybe, or less. And we're going to be experimenting and learning. We're going to be trying new things. And if those things didn't work, we're going to have to pivot and shift gears and try the next thing and figure out what works and have a lot more amplified feedback and have a lot more things going on that we potentially need to manage before hopefully at some point that level of chaos and that level of volatility starts to subside. With the COVID example, we're starting to see that hopefully a little bit now, and we can start to get back a little bit more to some level of normalcy. But just understanding that when we are going through disruption, and especially if that means our organization will either survive or not, how we operate from a strategy standpoint and the number of initiatives and the level of decision making that we need to make those quick decisions around is going to be significantly compressed and increased. And of course, the answer to the question is, how do we do that without an effective portfolio management practice? That's going to make it really hard to effectively make those decisions in that shorter time frame. So our traditional approach to strategy, typically, again, if we take that first year 0 to year 1 or year 1 to year 2, we're going to look like something like this, where we have our overall strategic objectives. There's going to spawn initiatives, which may last over the course of a year or less, or whatever those timeframes might be. And those are obviously going to have an impact to our business operation. And part of what we need to understand as we're taking a look at this traditional approach is those things are typically top down. We have governance and decision making that our managers and our teams, especially as part of projects, are expected to execute against. And that's going to be different in a digital organization, where we're going to see a lot more opportunities, again, either to cause disruption potentially across our industry or our market space, or potentially those disruptive events are happening. We're going to see technology playing a critical role in terms of the expectations that our customers are going to have with our organization. And so that increased rate of change and increased rate of engagement and feedback and understanding of those customer experiences and journeys is obviously going to have a lot more feedback into our initiatives, which then of course is going to have a lot more feedback into our business operations. And you notice that this isn't just top down anymore. It's happening a lot faster, but we're also seeing a lot more of that bottom up feedback too, where, as I mentioned before, maybe somebody figures out that I can take pictures of a document on my phone, and why can't I just submit that? And can we meet regulatory and compliance aspects for that instead of having to have formal tracking and formal software? And are there ways that that disruptive technology are going to change things potentially from a business operations standpoint that somebody might be doing for a different line of products or services that can impact what we do and ultimately inform our strategic initiatives and ultimately change our strategy through those feedback loops? So if we have a strategy that has to do with moving into a new market space or a new industry, or using digital technology to change what we do or how we do things, that certainly can still come from the strategic level. But at the same time, we can also see those things coming from more of this business operations level, like I talked about. And so understanding that those things can come from any part in the organization across implies and means, of course, that we've got to manage all of those things together. So for meeting the challenge, instead of just delivering what we're asked to do, and this is the opportunity for those of us as PMs and working at PMO, we need to be thinking about what can we do to enable the organization to either do new things through the use of digital technology, or what can we do through the use of digital technology to make the organization better at what it does today. And in order to be able to do those things, we've got to be able to execute on the following sub-bullets that you see here. We need to understand the impact of technology change on how the business works. And as things are evolving, do we not just have a separate R&D team in our organization, but do we really have it part of everyone's job and ultimately part of our culture to be looking out for those opportunities? And then to use the portfolio, to bring the portfolio into the conversation, can we use that to take a look at what we're currently doing today and what things we have in flight to evaluate whether those changes can yield new business opportunities, and not just necessarily for one part of the organization or for one product team, but really making sure that we're elevating that conversation and looking across horizontally at everything that we do. And the portfolio will enable us to do some of that. We need to be able to effectively communicate how emerging technology can grow the business. And that's a really important one. We don't, as an IT organization in particular, we're not just expected to do what we're told ideally and be an order taker, but we need to move into more of that trusted advisor and strategic partner type of a relationship with our organization. So we should have that seat at the table to be able to show that we can add value in that space versus just coming in. The business goes and finds a new technology or anything that they want to do. And then over time, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, they figure out that they can't support it on their own. And then they tap IT on the shoulder. And at that point, it's too late to be able to make the right decisions in a lot of cases. We need to be able to show the impact of changing where we invest. That one's pretty self-evident. And that's what the portfolio enables us to do through modeling and through showing what those investment opportunities look like. And then do we have the ability, and I alluded to this earlier, to use our existing capabilities to grow other parts of the business? If we have an effective portfolio management practice, that's much easier to do. So portfolio in a digital organization, to sum up this first section, is really about how can we use the portfolio to manage things across all of these different levels. And that's really the intention at a strategic, at a tactical as well as an operational level. And when we get involved as project managers from a planning perspective or kicking off projects, or hopefully ideally we're involved not just being assigned at the end of those business case decisions and those investment decisions, but we're integrated, whether we're working in portfolio management or we have the opportunity to have awareness of what's going on, to be able to influence some of that decision making and making sure that we're looking across the organization as a part of our role and as a part of our capabilities. I'm going to go through some basic portfolio management concepts here in the second part of this deck. And for many of you, based on the poll question answers, are going to be familiar with a lot of this. But again, putting a little bit of a different perspective on this than you maybe have seen before from a broader service management point of view. So what is a portfolio? Very simply is it's an investment framework. And ultimately, we're trying to take a look at what we're investing in, what are the collections of assets that we're investing in to give us the best return, and ultimately to achieve the outcomes that our organization as well as our customers are trying to achieve. ITIL 4, the newest framework from an IT service management perspective, talks about the concept of value co-creation, which I think is an interesting concept. So we're not just trying to enable outcomes for our customer, but we're really trying to continually develop our specialized organizational capabilities. And when you think about that from a digital technology perspective, that's a big part of what we need to be doing in order to stay effective in talking about some of those operational excellence types of perspectives. So we start with what we have today. And part of that is an understanding not just what's in our pipeline or what projects do we have in flight, but what are we investing in from our current products and services perspectives. So when we talk about portfolios, you see here on the bottom part of this slide that we have different subsets. We have products and service portfolios, we have project portfolios, we can have application portfolios. And we also need to start with understanding who our customers are and what are they asking us to do as an organization, so we can have customer portfolios. So putting all those things together enables us to understand the impact of changes. What happens if we need to change something? Or if we want to do something different or new, what do we need to potentially change our investment structures around? That's really what this is all about ultimately at the highest level. So in the ITIL 4 definition, I show that here. It basically says the purpose of this as a practice is to ensure that the organization has the right mix of programs, projects, products, and services to execute the organization strategy within its funding and resource constraints. So again, it's that translation of direction and vision into goals and objectives and then initiatives, and that translation from strategic to tactical, and then ultimately being able to realize that strategy by investing in the right things at the right time. So we're not just focusing on the project portfolio, but the other types as well. And if we want to do effective prioritization and effective modeling of what those changes could look like, we have to have more of that integrated approach. So I've got a couple of visuals to show you a little bit of what this looks like. As you look across those different types of portfolios, and we'll show what that looks like coming up here on the next slide. Typical portfolio structure should have the following categories. We want to obviously take a look at the future things, the new bright shiny objects that are out there, especially from a digital technology perspective, that can help us maintain or increase our competitive advantage and our unique value proposition. But we also need to be paying attention to what are the current products and services that make up our portfolio. And then, of course, we also need to have this retired section. And not that we still have retired products and services, but it's the information about those things. Making sure that we have an understanding of if we do need to learn from the past or bring something back potentially, whether that's for the short term or long term, we have the ability to quickly do that as part of our decision making. So as we go forward, we're going to have linkages between the IT investments, or excuse me, the IT assets that we invest in, what's in our portfolio, and then what are the business outcomes or the return on investments that those things are supporting. And ultimately, if you start to do this analysis and do that type of linkage, there's going to be some questions that are going to arise. And I've seen this many times in doing this type of analysis. So for example, do we have assets in our organization that aren't necessarily tied to anything in our portfolio that we're investing in? Well, why is that? What are we doing with this? And is this something that we should have retired? Is there something we should be not funding anymore? What's going on from what we're investing in and spending money on today? We also can have questions such as, okay, I see that this particular asset is supporting something that's currently in our portfolio, a particular product or service, but is it also supporting something that's supposed to have been retired? Well, what's going on with this linkage? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Is this something we should stop funding on, or take a look at, should we not have retired that after all because it's still supporting customer outcomes? Maybe so. And then on the opposite side, we see something that's not linked to our portfolio that apparently is linking to a business outcome. So what's going on with that? Is that something that's self-funded, or do we have shadow IT potentially going on in our organization? What is the status with that? And then, of course, if we have something that is retired but still is supporting a business outcome, okay, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. What's going on in that space? So you can kind of see through a logical diagram here, and obviously this is nice and clean and neat, and these things are typically more complicated, and those of you that work in portfolio management know this. But that's the idea here, is we want to be able to start to link, what are we investing in from an asset perspective? Where does that fit into our prioritized portfolio structure? And then what does that mean in terms of the things that are the highest priority? And I'll talk about this coming up in a couple slides, should be getting the highest amount of investment, and how we can apply those things to the things that are the truly most mission critical in our organization. Pause here and take a quick sip of water here. All right, I'll actually pause here real quick. I can't see the chat. Are there any chat questions so far, Brian or George, that anybody's chatted in that I can pause and take a look at?
Let me take a look. I haven't seen. Cheryl commented, love the visual, very enlightening. I think it was on the last slide, the prior slide.
Okay, appreciate that.
Yeah, no other questions though.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah, just want to take a quick drink of water. I'm trying to fight off a cold here again, and keep my throat moist will help. All right, I've got another quick logical diagram to share with everyone, and this is really putting together some of the big picture of how different types of portfolios work together. So the first place that we want to start off is understanding the value to the organization. I mentioned the concept of value co-creation just a minute ago. So what's ultimately going to be defined is, again, helping to fulfill our strategy, helping to fulfill our purpose and our vision of where we want to be from a perspective standpoint in the future. Understanding and defining that up front is really important, of course, to have that understanding and that perspective. And then ultimately, we need to have some linkage based on that discussion around that outside-in perspective of our customers. And you see a couple of different arrows that you'll see across these different linkages. You'll see this gray arrow means that it's setting objectives for, and then the orange arrow means that it's enabling or limiting something. So in this conversation, the value to the organization is ultimately going to set objectives for what customers are we going to engage with through the use of our products and services, and what are the things that they're ultimately asking for us to do from them is going to enable and limit the value that we can co-create with them and with our own organization. So understanding that is the starting point is really important. And then ultimately we can then have that linkage between our customers are going to set objectives for which products and services we offer. Our products and services are ultimately what we can do as a response to that demand is going to enable and limit which customers we're going to do business with. And we can't be all things to all people, obviously, as a part of that discussion. And then available resources are showing up here. So our products and services are going to set objectives for what available resources we want to invest in and what we can do to help establish some of our specialized organizational capabilities. And of course, those resources are going to enable and limit what products and services we can ultimately create, deliver, and support as part of our offerings. And then our available funds, of course, are going to enable and limit our resources, and what we're doing to move down this chain are ultimately going to set the objectives for what we should be funding. So this is the big picture. And then, of course, you're probably asking yourself, okay, well, where does the project portfolio fit into this equation? So the answer to that question is when we need to do something new or different, we're going to see that linkage back to our programs and our projects. So when we think about this, our products and services are going to help set objectives for the different programs and projects we're going to invest in. And this gets into, are we doing something new that maybe we haven't done before for a new move into a corollary industry or market space or geography. And then, of course, those programs and projects are going to set objectives for the available resources we need to make those changes. And then our resources are going to ultimately limit what programs and projects we can kick off and start. And ultimately, we don't want to be doing too many things. But if we're in that period of instability or volatility or disruption, like we talked about earlier, we're going to need to understand that linkage. And that's going to be really important. And of course, that's going to enable and limit what products and services ultimately we can offer. All right, so logical diagram, like I said, this is much more messy in real life, but this is the idea where some of these different pieces need to fit together. And again, we don't start over here on the left with our funding. That's certainly going to inform and enable and limit what we can do, but we've really got to start from more of that outside-in perspective and understanding our strategy, understanding our vision, understanding the value we're trying to co-create with our customers and what that means for our organization and working through that perspective. So a little bit different, I think, than what many organizations that I've seen are thinking about, or how they're prioritizing how they work through the creation of their portfolios and how those things should flow together. And if you are doing this right, you know how powerful this is an investment framework to help model those changes based on being able to prioritize based on these different factors. So how do I go about building a portfolio, especially if I'm starting to do this from scratch, or maybe I have something that's not necessarily as effective as what I need it to be? I think the first thing is just to have that vision and direction of what you're trying to do with your portfolio. And especially as you're moving toward being more of a digital organization or dealing with potential transformation or disruptive forces. What's your current state? Can you inventory your projects, and not just the things that are PMO managed, but there's lots of organizations that have projects that are going on that potentially fall outside of the PMO. So can I put together that picture of what's in my pipeline, what's in flight, what's completed? Can I start to build out my application portfolio? And then in similar terms, what are my different products and services, and have those different pictures of what I'm doing today from a current state perspective. And then again, big picture, I need to start on the right hand of that previous diagram. What is the value that I'm trying to create? What are the outcomes that I'm trying to facilitate? Can I tie that to customer demand and usage and what our customers are ultimately asking for us to do for them as an organization? Can I look at things from more of that horizontal value stream perspective and elevate that to more of the business level versus just within that individual development team focus, especially if I am working in an agile or DevOps perspective? I've got to elevate those things to a larger portfolio view, right? Product backlog is not the same thing as a portfolio, right? Product backlog are requirements that should be informed by the portfolio and those decisions that we're making on what we're investing in. So that's a key thing to pay attention to there as well. So linkage to my investments, my business cases. I want finance involved, obviously, in all of this work to sign off on what I'm putting together. And then I mentioned earlier and alluded to this idea of a little bit of Pareto principle. And again, especially if you're first starting out, you don't have to figure out everything, but define what's mission critical in your organization. What's that top 20%? And work on that first. Align your investments there. Make sure that those things that really are critical, especially if I am in a disruptive or a chaotic state, and I need to make quicker decisions, I'm going to pay attention to those things first. And ultimately, those things should be kind of reverse 80-20 as far as that top 20% ideally should be getting 80% of my investment, especially if I am in a disruptive type of a situation where I'm dealing with volatility and complexity and uncertainty and ambiguity. I'm going to talk about all that here in a couple slides. Okay, we have lots of different tools that we can use. And if we have anything that's currently working, we want to continue to try and build on that or make sure that those things are fit for purpose. And bringing in the guiding principle of start where you are. And if you need to really just do this from scratch, pick one service or one product and try and build that out and make sure that it is kind of fitting into that mission critical perspective as much as you can, and show what good looks like, get feedback, make sure that your organization's strategy and priorities and what we are going to do from a scope perspective versus what we're not going to do can be modeled as you're building out that portfolio view. Got a slide here on who owns the portfolio, and that's pretty straightforward. Most of you are going to know this, but typically, depending on if you're looking at this from an IT or an organizational perspective, you've got the accountable piece at the highest levels. You're going to have an enterprise PMO or a dedicated portfolio team's going to be responsible. and then a team of people that are listed here that are going to be involved in helping to make those decisions, to characterize the pipeline from a demand perspective and put together that supply response. You're going to need these different team members involved in that. When we take this into a project perspective and look at the different changes that we're going to be making through our projects, typical organizations that I've worked with have these high-level project portfolio categories. We typically see things that are mandatory that we have to do, typically if those are part of regulatory and compliance pieces. We have a strategic line item that we want to try and do as much work as we can there, but recognizing, and again, this is a little bit from an IT perspective, we know we're going to have tech lifecycle projects, and we should have a line item that we can allocate some resources and funding to having a track for improvement. And that is typically, those bottom two things are typically the things that get shortchanged when we're in a disruptive or a chaotic state. But we do want to make sure that those focuses aren't costing us later in terms of unplanned work or creating emergencies that we could have been more proactive around. So you have to let me know in chat if those line up pretty similarly to what you see in your organizations, but those are typically what we see. And then what we need to do from an intake and evaluation perspective is understand and have some type of a prioritization mechanism. And sometimes that can be stack ranking through these different categories. Sometimes it can be a forced allocation where we limit the number of projects that we do and make sure that we're taking a balanced approach. And then in a lot of cases, we're taking a look at where our spend is from a keeping the business running perspective versus keeping the business evolving. And as we advance in our maturity with our portfolio and having that type of either category or attribute to taking a look at the types of projects we're doing and where we're at today versus where we want to be, that can be very helpful as well. In most organizations, and I'll say typical, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush because I know a lot of organizations are moving toward a more agile portfolio management type of a perspective, which fits right in with what we're talking about. That typical organizational cadence when things aren't chaotic, you've got an annual plan of record cycle with quarterly true-ups. But the problem with that is that project intake that I've seen, depending on the level of governance, review and authorization can sometimes take 2 to 3 months. And is that going to work if we're dealing with a digital organization? And then you've got some type of zero-based budgeting model that I think can work well in all cases where we know at any given point what's above and below the line in that plus and minus 10%. That should be familiar to a lot of you. But if we're in a digital organization responding to those opportunities to make that shift or to enter into a new market space or to do things differently through digital technology or do things that we haven't done before, these other things need to be part of the discussion. So what truly is mission critical? And I mentioned that earlier. Do we have the ability to evaluate and use the portfolio to model ecosystem or market or industry changes in what we're investing in today? What if we're working through parallel operating models and we have parts of the organization with different ways of working or focused on different parts of a digital transformation versus in a lot of cases we have the legacy stuff that really is still the key revenue generation for our organization. And those things still have to be kept alive and up and running at some minimum level until we can make that transition. Organizational change management is a big part of this, and I could spend a whole presentation talking about that. And I know there's lots of people that have come to PMI, WIC, and talked about OCM. That's critical in this conversation. Who's driving that? How do we integrate that in with our portfolio decision making and what we should and shouldn't do? We can have dynamic funding models, which I've alluded to a little bit. We need to streamline our decision making. We can't just be looking at annual cycles. And making sure that we have the right visibility and transparency that we showed in that visual across the strategy, across our initiatives, and across our business operations. And again, how do you make these decisions effectively without a portfolio? So emphasizing why this is so important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on VUCA. I don't know if this is a new acronym or term for many of you, or if you've seen this before. Chat in and let me know if you've seen VUCA before. I'd be curious to know. But the idea here is that you're dealing with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this is definitely a characteristic of the things that you're going to run into as you're working through digital transformations or responding to digital disruptions. And when we have to shorten or compress our strategic and financial cycles, a lot of the time it's because we're dealing with one or more of these different types of factors, and how well we can predict the outcome of our actions and how much we know about the situation ultimately is going to play into dealing with things, and just the rate of change and the rate of evolving of digital technology and our organizations becoming more digital. Living in this VUCA world is just the reality that we're in, and how we go about reacting to that. There's some good guidance out there from a strategic standpoint on recognizing if you're in any of these or one or more of these spaces, and how to use that feedback to analyze our investments, and not just at the project level, but once we've gone live and we are co-creating the value and facilitating and enabling the outcomes that we want to see through our products and services. So curious to know if this is something that's familiar to you, but just recognize that you probably have seen that or will see that if you haven't already. So some key takeaways. Hopefully all of you have recognized and seen through this presentation, and probably a lot of you know already, that portfolio management as a capability and as a practice is essential to enabling digital transformations and responding to digital disruption. So we've got to reflect our decisions and our investments accurately in our portfolios. We know we're going to have to drive faster investment decision making. We need to be able to model changes on what we're doing and what we would potentially deprioritize, or change the service levels around if we're moving something to a lower priority, or potentially move to that retired state, so that we can do the new things that we need to do, and ultimately find that balance between improvement and transformation. We align to our strategic focus through our projects and those changes we're making. And of course, what's the risk appetite of our organization? That can change pretty dynamically too, based on if we're dealing with some type of a transformation or disruptive state, based on what's going on in our industry or our market space, and how that maybe changes where we need to go to catch up with our competition, or to grow, or to potentially change our unique value proposition through what we're enabled to do through digital technology. So final slide
Hey,
here.
Jeff, there was a
Go ahead.
Hey, Jeff, there was a question.
Certainly.
There was a question. I think it was 2 slides ago.
Okay.
But Brian asked, for mission critical, is it common to have competing factors or input on what is mission critical? Or would that be a team on its own?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And so defining what's mission critical is something that's going to evolve. And that's part of defining that top 20% shouldn't just be an annual discussion either, right? Especially if, as I showed in that visual, where if you've got shortened strategic cycles, that's going to change. So who determines who that is? Ultimately, your highest, C-levels board of directors should be involved in those discussions, but they shouldn't do it in isolation, right? Everybody across the organization should have an understanding of what those things are and what's changing. And I've seen situations where, from an IT perspective, I was just supporting some small little departmental SharePoint site that started to get shared externally through marketing with different external customer groups. And we were supporting at the time on a little shared server that had no high availability or security or redundancy or anything at all. And all of a sudden, a month later, it had to be completely re-architected because it had changed that fast and became mission critical. So typically the things that are mission critical have to do with governance and regulatory and compliance things. They have to do with revenue generation. They have to do with the reputation of your organization, and it can't be everything. So the hard part in this is everybody from a different department perspective in your organization is going to have their thing that they want it to be mission critical, but ultimately you need to have the right steering committee and board of directors to make those hard decisions. And you can't do everything. The biggest part of strategy, and one of the hardest things of strategy, is to figure out what you're not going to do, not what you are going to do, and to say no to certain things, at least for now. And to, again, at a project level, if you can have that zero-based budgeting perspective, so I know at any given time, hopefully some things end early, or I get resources increased, or I get people back from things that finish well, and I can immediately know what that next thing is that I'm going to move to. Does that help answer the question? Hopefully, let me know in chat, please.
Yeah, Brian, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so to finish up, and I do want to leave a little bit of time, hopefully, for some more questions. I see we're just about at 8 minutes till the top of the hour. It went fast for me. What can all of you do to influence or move things forward? If you're in a portfolio management role, obviously you need to just continue to make sure that you're aligned with the organization strategy, and you're helping to translate that not only into the PMO and into the projects in your organization, but really be that bridge to help make sure that you can drive that organizational alignment, whether you're doing it through cascading objectives or OKRs. Make sure that you recognize that you have a role to play in this, whether you're part of portfolio or not. And it's ultimately about helping the organization achieve its strategy and achieve its vision. So do you know what your organization's strategic goals and objectives are versus just your team level? Can you give that elevator pitch and be able to share the value of your role and how you're helping to make those things happen? Can you become more involved in meetings that include strategic discussions? And I kind of jumped down to the bottom here just to have that curiosity and change the perspective. Take yourself out of your own role and say, well, if I'm a customer or if I'm a business partner and I'm talking to them, can I ask them some of those key questions to say, well, how's this working for you? And what could we be doing better or differently? Or what do we need to improve? And how's this impacting things from what you're taking with what we're providing you? And what does that mean in terms of helping to develop the business products and services? So encourage all of you to have that curiosity and figure out how you can make people's jobs easier or better. Make appointments with people in your business organizations and ask those questions and build relationships. And I'll skip back here to this final bullet here on this top part, which is, I'm sure all of us have seen situations, and feel free to chat in on this too. How many of you have found out about something that was planned, but was missing a key element that could have been added if you would have been involved up front? And I think I know of several situations where I've been in that type of a situation and been in those shoes. I'm sure a lot of you have too. So look for opportunities to understand your portfolio, what it's comprised of, what those investments are. And obviously that'll provide context to the projects you're working on, the new capabilities you're developing, as well as the things that you're trying to change or improve. So I'll leave it there. We'll have hopefully time for a couple more questions. I can stop sharing and look at chat. I know that the PMI WIC group is going to share out this deck. If you're interested in connecting with me or learning more about my business and what we offer from a consulting or a training perspective, I've got a couple of slides in the deck that show our consulting services, including working to stand up and drive strategy, design, and architecture, and translating that into portfolios, and helping to stand up PMOs, as well as training services across Agile and DevOps, value stream mapping, process engineering, and ITSM and ITIL. So appreciate the opportunity to be here and present for all of you, and appreciate you spending your hour with me over lunch today. I'll stop sharing and switch over and see if there's any other questions that I can help answer.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions. I had to chuckle. Janelle made a comment in the chat about the VUCA. Her feedback from what she found on Google. I thought that was funny. That is so true.
It is, and it's very much just like I said, the reality of our situation today. We're dealing with disruptive forces across our organizations pretty much as a norm now, and getting back to that quote unquote normal. I know I used COVID as an example, but there's going to be the next thing that's going to be changing out there, and it's just a matter of time. And if you look at the rate of change in terms of technology and our ways of working over the last 10 years and how crazy that's been, the next 10 years I think are going to be even more so.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions or chat. So with that, Jeff, thank you so much. Thank you, Cheryl. I saw your comment on here as well.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Jeff, thanks again for spending time, and those on the participants today, thank you for taking your lunch hour to listen to the presentation, and we appreciate it. You have the contact information for Jeff, and we'll share the presentation so you'll have it in email as well. Thanks again, and everybody have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, everyone.